Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Judy and I love travel, history, and finding out what makes things work. I've been leading you all over the south of France, focusing on cities that date back to the days of Imperial Rome. Last time we did a walking tour of Nîmes. Nîmes wasn't an imperial capital, but it was an extremely important city in Gaul. Under the Roman Empire, became a colony called Colonia Nimausis, named after a local water god. It flourished during the reign of Emperor Augustus, growing to perhaps 50,000 inhabitants, and was strategically located along the Via Domitia, a key trade and military route. As the population grew, it outpaced the water available. One big part of Roman urban planning was to turn provincials into enthusiastic citizens of empire by providing them with all the amenities they'd find in Roman cities. And those amenities, things like fountains, public baths, and sewerage systems, all required a reliable source of water, more than the local wells and springs could provide. Roman engineers solved this problem by building an aqueduct, tapping a reliable spring located only about 12 miles to the north of the city. One part of that aqueduct was a bridge, still there, called the Pont du Gard. Come take a look with me, the armchair traveler, as your guide. The Romans were skilled engineers and surveyors, and when they planned the route for the Nimes Aqueduct, which includes the famous Pont du Gard, they used several sophisticated techniques to ensure a steady, gradual decline in the conduits over a very long distance. They didn't just look, guess, and hope for the best. They measured everything. As they marked out their route, they also did their best to avoid obstacles, even if it meant taking the long way around, which is exactly what happened here. Getting all those lines and angles correct over a distance that turned out to be more than 30 miles with the instruments available at the time required plenty of work on the ground. Before construction could even begin, they dug trial trenches to determine whether the soil was stable enough to support what they were going to put on it. They examined the terrain to identify the best, flattest route. Natural features like hills, valleys, and rivers were carefully assessed to determine if tunnels, bridges, or embankments would be necessary. And finally, the surveyors would have placed markers along the planned path to make sure that the people who did the digging and the building followed the line they had laid out. They may not have had satellite imagery and computers, but they did have accurate surveying tools, experience, plenty of labor, and suitable building materials, including limestone outcrops found not just at the source where the springs were, but throughout the region. They also had surveying tools, still recognizable to us today. Among these was a groma, shown above on the left, which was made up of a vertical shaft with cross arms and plumb lines to establish straight lines and right angles. The modern equivalent of it is called a theodolite. They also used an instrument called a chorobate, which is recognizable, at least to me, as a kind of birret level, although somewhat bigger than the one I have in my utility room. They used this to ensure that the inclines were level or at the angle that they wanted. Today, the Groman and chorobate are still in use, but are generally incorporated into a modern device called a total station. Many of these include GPS capability, so the marks they made could be placed accurately on maps. You've probably seen surveyors and flagmen measuring your neighborhood for things like new water pipes with a combined instrument just like this one on the right. The water source here is a group of 10 springs, located close to a smaller Roman city located to the north of Nîmes, today called Uzès. The springs were natural outlets for a large underground aquifer, which was fed by rainwater runoff. The underlying rock in the region was primarily limestone, which meant that the spring water that came out of it would be what we would call hard. Put a pin in that fact, which will play into the deterioration of the system over the long term. I've circled the source and the destination for you on the map on the left and marked them with blue push pins on the satellite image of the region on the right. The springs sit at an elevation of a little over 250 feet above sea level, and the destination was about 193 feet. The downhill slope was going to work just fine. The most direct route, I've marked it with a yellow line on the imagery map, was only about 12 miles. The problem was that the terrain was not flat at all, as you can see in this image. It's pockmarked with hills, valleys, rivers, and streams, each of which would have had to have been gotten around in a way that would let the water flow continuously, but at a controlled rate. They picked a zigzag route marked on the map on the left with a blue line. It's 3 times longer than the straight direction would have been. Roman engineering skill meant that the elevation changed less than 16 feet per mile. Thanks to this much longer route, though, the water took about a day and a half to travel the entire distance from the springs to Nimes. Roman citizens, whether they lived in the capital, a major city, or in the provinces, were very aware of water quality. Their first priority was safe, fresh drinking water for the people, and they took steps to acquire it, which meant maintaining clean water supplies. Their beliefs and practices around water quality were rooted in practical engineering and some religious ideas. Romans believed that clear flowing water was the purest and the healthiest. They didn't have microscopes, so they couldn't see microbes, but they were well aware of the fact that some water was good for drinking, other was good mostly for cooking, and still other was only fit for using in the sewers and agriculture. Their experience told them that spring water was the best, followed by river water, provided it was fast-flowing and unpolluted, followed by the third choice of rainwater stored in cisterns. The water here had to be gathered up and shunted into channels for transportation to Nimes. The first stop would have been a holding basin, where dirt and debris, things like rocks and dirt, would settle out before the water moved downstream toward Nimes. These were called piscina limaria. Piscina means a pool or a basin, and limaria comes from the word limus or limus, meaning mud or settlement. And that tells us what they're talking about is a settling basin. These basins were strategically placed along various points in the system, especially near the source and sometimes before distribution points in the city. What you see here is the remains of one of these basins, located quite close to the springs themselves. Once the water was out of the ground, collected, and had been allowed to settle, it needed to flow to its destination in conduits. These could be made out of stone, brick, concrete, even terracotta or lead. The Nimes Aqueduct conduits were not built out of solid reinforced concrete in the way modern aqueducts might be. They were built out of carefully cut and fit stone, often lined with a material called opus signinum. I don't think I said that properly, a kind of Roman hydraulic mortar made from crushed tiles and lime, which would make them relatively waterproof. No matter how carefully built, however, some water was going to be lost through seepage from the conduit itself. If the conduits were above ground, they were generally topped with slabs of rock to keep out debris like leaves and stones. This photograph shows you the Pont du Gard channel and conduit. Although the covering slabs were a convenient size to be stolen and doubtless were repurposed into building materials, pipes didn't much figure into this system until the water reached its final collection tank for distribution, which we'll visit in Nimes. Ideally, most of the conduit would be run above or slightly above local ground level. That would have required the least amount of labor, even though they would have had to support it on short piers like this one, which is now mostly disassembled for the stone. In other areas, the conduit might be placed in a shallow trench, somewhat below ground level, and then covered over. Whether above ground or underground, the idea was to protect the conduits and to follow the contours of the terrain by adjusting the depth of the trench or the height of the piers. System planners routed their work around obstacles like hills whenever they could, but sometimes that proved impossible, and they would be forced to dig a tunnel, a much bigger job than just digging a trench, as you can see in this illustration from National Geographic. Diggers would climb down from the top of the hill and work toward each other in teams. This drawing doesn't show the far end, it would have been on the left side of the picture, but eventually the diggers would have tunneled through the hill and emerged at the other end. Tunneling would take far more time and labor, and there was always a chance the diggers between two sections might miss one another, so whenever possible the planners avoided it, although avoiding it often could and did add to the length of the project. Valleys presented a very different problem. When they could not be avoided by route planning, they had to be crossed by bridges. In areas where aqueducts had to cross a valley or a river, they did so on a stone bridge, often with multiple tiers of arches for stability. This schematic shows you how the Pont du Gard was designed. Notice that the bridge is far wider than the river, which is just the area marked in gray, since it had to move water from one side of the valley, which was much wider than the river proper, to the other and still maintain the appropriate downhill slope. Downhill in this graphic would be toward the right and is labeled Nimes. Here's how they likely built it. If you've ever gawked at a construction site, much of this is going to seem familiar, except most of the effort is done by human beings and animals rather than by cranes and bulldozers. The first step was to divert the water from the river by putting in a series of temporary coffer dams. These are just barriers made out of beams and stones to hold the water back and create a dry working area so workers could put in a pier. They had no way to excavate under the river bottom to build a stable platform, so they laid massive limestone blocks directly on the riverbed itself. The lowest tier had 6 large arches to distribute the weight evenly across that part of the river valley. The foundation and tiers were built out of huge limestone blocks, some of them weighing up to 6 tons. The stones were carefully cut and fitted so tightly that they didn't require mortar. This was clearly a case of insert block A right here and don't even think about putting it anyplace else. The weight of the blocks anchored the structure quite securely. Roman infrastructure might seem overbuilt to us today, but that's one reason why it's still standing. The builders didn't have computers showing them how to cut corners. Once all the piers were in place, the next step would be to put in scaffolding and temporary Roman arches on the first tier to support construction of a second tier, above which ran a pedestrian and vehicle roadway. Workers again hauled pre-cut limestone blocks into place, this time using wooden cranes, pulleys, and ramps. When that was completed, it was time for the top tier, which held the channel for the water. Stones were lifted to this height by winches and treadmill cranes, operated by workers walking inside large wooden wheels to generate the lifting power. The final tier was a waterproof channel made out of stone, lined with the same opus signium we learned about earlier. Once each arch was completed, the wooden century was gradually removed, allowing the stones to lock into place through gravity. This thing was enormously heavy and wasn't going anyplace short of an earthquake. The completed structure was allowed to sit for a while and tested for stability before being put into full use. After a day and a half of meandering, the water from the springs finally makes its way into Nimes, to a castellum, a water collection and holding chamber. This picture doesn't begin to do it justice because there weren't any humans about to catch in the photo to give you an idea of the scale. But the thing is nearly 20 feet across and originally was almost 6 feet deep. From there, the land inside the city walls sloped downhill. Remember that the system was almost entirely gravity-powered. The holes you see in the side walls here were originally fitted with pipes of one variety or another, leading water to fountains and businesses and homes set up in the rest of the city. This line drawing gives you a very general idea of how the system worked in practice, although it does have a few features not found here. In Nimes, for example, there was only one castellum. From there, water flowed to homes, which paid for the privilege, public baths, fountains, and more by way of underground pipes. I always wondered how the water got from the pipes even 3 or 4 feet upwards into those fountains, and the answer was that the castellum was still above the level of the fountains. The water was literally forced up into the fountain by water pressure. In many cases, instead of flowing directly to the floors of individual buildings, like apartment houses today, water could be stored in cisterns at ground level and then pumped or siphoned when needed. Those hand pumps looked quite a bit like the pumps on cisterns I remember seeing as a child on a farm. Next time The Wizard of Oz comes on TV, pay attention to the early scenes, the part in sepia tones, and you'll see a classic hand pump visible on Aunt Em and Uncle Henry's farm in Kansas. It looked quite a bit like this one. The aqueduct was a marvel of Roman engineering, built efficiently and to last, but nothing lasts forever if you don't maintain it. The system continued to work as designed even as the empire contracted and left the area, but without maintenance, eventually it did fall into disrepair. Pipes inside the city scaled up with lime carried here from the original spring, shrinking their diameter and letting ever less water through with each passing year. The underlying geology housing the aquifer was primarily limestone, and limestone means hard water. There was no imperial Culligan man, and over time, first the pipes and then the larger conduits would have been narrowed and fouled with scale and also sediment. The second problem was that the collapse of Roman authority in Gaul meant there was no longer anyone whose job it was to check for leaks or other damage and repair it, or to stop people both inside and outside the city from hooking up and stealing water without paying for it. Each hookup would have meant a tiny reduction in the amount of water that made it to the public conveniences. Outside the city, residents fishing the stones and repurposing them, and there was no one to stop them. Neglect and some theft of the stones meant that parts of the system literally vanished. The Nimes Aqueduct remained in use for over 300 years, and with proper maintenance might have lasted far longer. Problems did cut the water flow, but those could have been fixed if the water was still needed as much as it had once been. Before the arrival of the Romans, Nimes boasted a Celtic population of perhaps, and estimates vary widely, of as many as 5,000 people. Those people got by with fresh water from the sacred spring, after which the city was named, as well as a combination of wells and possibly rainwater collected and stored in cisterns. During the Roman period, the population ballooned to somewhere between 30 and 50,000 people. Again, the estimates are crazily wide, which is why they needed that aqueduct. After the Romans withdrew, the population shrank down to perhaps as few as 10,000 or so. The local people left behind could get by with water from local streams, wells, and cisterns. They saw no purpose in fixing this infrastructure. Why is the Pont du Gard still standing? I believe this is because the stones used to build it, except perhaps those covering the channel at the top, were literally too heavy for anyone to steal, and the structure was too sturdy to collapse or fall over from anything short of a major earthquake. Earthquakes happen, but are quite rare in the south of France, or perhaps a bomb. The bridge remained in use as a bridge long after the water system failed, and continued in regular use for local traffic off and on until at least the 18th century, when a road bridge, where you see the people walking here, was finally put in. In 1970, when I visited and watched, cars were still crossing. Today, visitors can cross over the top of the bridge along a designated pedestrian footpath, and for the more adventurous, you can even go swimming in the river. The river is fairly shallow here most of the year, and downstream there's even a nice sandy beach, although it gets pretty crowded during the summer season. I was invited by a couple of fellow tourists I met in the area, college-age people like me, to go swimming. I turned them down mostly because it was too cold. Now I'm probably too old. Thank you for walking with me today. Come back next time for another adventure with me, the Armchair Traveler, as your guide. Thank you for traveling with me today. This year, we'll be making a grand tour of France, not just the famous cities, although we'll hit them too, but some lesser known gems. The basis of all my French posts is my personal on-the-ground visits, extending over a period of more than half a century. I took a lot of pictures, I asked a lot of questions, and I tried to write down the answers. Things change, even in a puny human lifetime, and most French cities are considerably older than I am, so a great deal of research goes into each one of these presentations. Most of that work never makes it into the videos except as an incidental reference or a mention. You might wonder what happens to the rest of it. Well, I write it down, and sometimes, if it seems interesting enough, and I admit that is a matter of taste, I write it up and post it separately. If you want to know more, check the description box below. I'll put in links from time to time for more information. Sometimes this will be information I dug up, other times it'll be links to what I hope are honest, reputable sources. In addition, I have a travel blog, a health and wellness blog, because travel is easier if we're healthy, and can be found on Blue Sky and Facebook. The addresses are all to the side of this video. Finally, I have a favor to ask. If you enjoyed my post, please like, subscribe, and share. This will help my channel grow. Thank you, and keep on traveling.